3, 2, 1.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to sort of something we haven't done before. I think this is going to be really interesting and collaborative for us. But my name is Tiffany Lau. I'm the Executive Director for ULI Hong Kong, and I'm delighted to be joined by a great coalition of collaborators and professionals and people that really care about Hong Kong and its future. This is the new Central Harbourfront Spark Salon webinar. We're going to be going through a lot of content tonight, so stick with us. But over the last few months, ULI has been engaged in something called the Forum for a New Central, where we've been diving deep into issues that face Central, not just as a physical construct, but this idea of a new Central and what that could mean for our great city. A lot of topics to cover tonight, but we're going to focus on a few important ones. And again, the future of Site 3, which specifically is what we're going to focus on tonight, is actually a site that we identified a few years ago as one that we needed to really talk about in terms of what is its future? How do we get away from the typical development models to ensure that we have a more inclusive waterfront that really serves the people of Hong Kong? So we engaged with our community of professionals to debate and discuss the future of this site, and we decided to solicit the views of a high-level panel of our members and experts to really compare our waterfront against other global cities. What are the opportunities and challenges that we continue to face there? So I don't want to take up too much airtime, but I'm going to hand it over to Kevin to talk more about the reason we're all gathered here today and some of our historical efforts around this iconic site.
Thanks, Tiffany. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Zhou. I've been a collaborator with the folks here in this effort. So in addition to kind of the high-level panel of experts, at the same time, we thought it would be quite meaningful to have public participation and have the public weigh in on this question as well of what can or should be done with Site 3. And so a coalition that included the Human Cities Initiative at Stanford University, the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, Designing Hong Kong, Collaborate Hong Kong, and ULI, sought the views of the broader public, including academics, nonprofits, arts groups, architecture, design and planning professionals, and others. And through a multitude of breakout groups, in person, if you can still imagine what that would be like, we sought to bring together ideas and aspirations for what Site 3 really could be and what it could offer to the Hong Kong public. And then these recommendations from that panel of international and local experts, as well as these civic groups from around Hong Kong, were packaged together in a report that was then shared with the government. And Tiffany?
Yes, so this report, which actually we were hesitant to widely distribute for political reasons, it's actually called 10 Principles for Creating a Development Brief for the Disposition and Development of Site 3. This is really based on prior reports that ULI has put together for the government, also along the same lines of 10 principles. And thankfully, this report was met with sort of open ears and open minds. And it appears, obviously, now that the government has revisited this particular tender for Site 3, and they are now using the two envelope process to evaluate these proposals. And that is actually an early win that we can all share together.
And so kind of with this two envelope process, so rather than going with kind of the traditional bid, now you're able to first evaluate based on design principles and kind of public offerings first before you kind of move on to the more financial aspects of the site. And through this larger process of conversation, there were really many great ideas about public space that were surfaced, also ideas about places for recreation, for performing arts, accessibility and what engenders a sense of welcome, and different elements that would make a place feel more local, right? And so a lot of designers talked about this need for public spiritedness. So as this two envelope process moves forward, we hope once again that Hong Kongers of all stripes can contribute, and hence we have today this open call for proposals. And based on the themes that were identified at the Site 3 workshops and some of these subsequent small group discussions, today's current initiative highlights 3 core areas that we hope you can think about when designing for the site. And so first, access and connectivity, if the site is easy to get to and links to its surroundings. Second, having flexible public space that empowers civic programming for the diverse people of Hong Kong. And third, celebrating and building with, rather than demolishing and replacing, the heritage and culture that exist on this site.
So we hope many of you will join this open call. It is an open call for proposals, ideas, but really it's to share your hopes and dreams for this site. Right now, we still have some time. The tender closes in mid-June, and we believe now is the time to really inspire our community of not just ourselves, professionals, and kind of engaged citizens, but everyone. This is really about turning it to the general public. And we at ULI will compile the best ideas, and we will share them with the relevant government departments. So have this in mind, but as we move forward with this 2 envelope approach, we think this is really going to be a powerful opportunity to make your voice heard.
So now we're going to turn it over to Professor Ying Zhou to share more about the civic spaces that are in the area. And the professor is an architect who joined the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong in 2016. Prior to her move to Hong Kong, she taught and researched contemporary cities at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Please take a hit. I think you're still muted.
Hi, so now everyone can hear me. So thank you for the introduction, Kevin. And thank you also to Tiffany, to everybody in this group who has been making a great effort for this future. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit is, in a way, both the physicality, the forms with which architects and urbanists would be very concerned for the future of the site, and of course of the softwares, the functions, the circulations, the connections, and the histories and associations, for which that would be very important in developing this part of Hong Kong, which is very much about the civic. So the 4 things I'm tabling here are the urban face of Hong Kong, the City Hall buildings, and the GPO, the General Post Office, is an ensemble. The realities of infrastructure and development priorities, namely that of highways, MTRs, as well as the commercial programs. And within all of this, as kind of a background, the civic, is it still possible? What I share today began actually as a series of architectural design studios at Hong Kong U since 2017. We began actually very much looking at the City Hall as an ensemble in the beginning. We started by taking apart and looking very closely at this place we all know very well. And this is, of course, what we have the luxury to do in the academy. In analyzing the history of each of these buildings, we see that the rising skyline very much manifests the history of Hong Kong itself. The changing materialities of the facades, from the masonry structures to the taut glass towers that rise, very much reveal the economic transitions that have taken place in our city. They tell the story of the old trade houses and the new global capital that makes this place what it is. Of course, what also makes this place very special is that it is located along the Victoria Harbour. So it gives very much this urban face that is extremely clearly visible. And that's something that makes it quite different, let's say, with other cities that do not have the luxury of such a harbor. We can see from the plan, for example, that all of this was very carefully composed and deliberate. There's an axis leading from the HSBC tower aligned to the Star Ferry. So I don't know if you can see my mouse. There are other alignments that were designed within this ensemble. For example, the alignment, of course, to the cenotaph from the City Hall, and the public spaces. The Edinburgh Place, this was a former Queen's Pier. This was, of course, the old Star Ferry terminal. And this is the parking garage that still stands there, and the GPO that faces the waterfront. So a lot of these boats actually landed right under the basement of the GPO, delivering the mail that makes all of Central buzz still today. These public spaces, of course, and the have been changing, but the public spaces is actually even more highlighted by the functions that take place within them. Oops. We can see here the library, the concert halls, the museum, the ferry pier, the post office. These public functions, including the schools and railways that came all at the same moment in history during the industrial age under modernity. Our predecessors at that moment thought these functions that were civic and the spaces that went along with them not only make us better citizens and better society, but also possible because we all live together in the city. So here you can see again the very urban and civic face of Hong Kong from the Victoria Harbour. We know that this face would very quickly change around the mid-2000s with the land reclamations that you can see that took place in the lower right of this image. The decision to ensure that Hong Kong's economic success had been made already in the 1990s as a result of many things. Infrastructure was and is always been seen as a strategic to development and therefore of priority. We know for example, in Hong Kong with the West Kowloon, that the conceptions for what to do with the landfilled hectares, which take place around here and all the blue infills, the conceptions for these spaces that will be created only took place after Kowloon Station itself opened in the heart of West Kowloon. Similarly, when we come back to our city center, Central, here the highways are again prioritized. The consequences, of course, result not only in the questions of dismantling of the civic face that we just looked at, but the indeliberateness of the resultant spaces grouped around roads rather than around plazas. So you can see as architects, the shift that took place between here and here on the right. So the plazas are no longer designed as plazas, but they're left over from the roads that were created around them. It was also important, of course, to look at the study of the ground, because ground is not only for cars, but it's for people. And cars, which have been romanticized since the post-war era of the 1950s, and has since been regarded as mistakes scarring the city already in the West, shows us already that Kono Road, which separates the City Hall to the north and Statue Square to the south, is also a very large rupture and disconnect. So in order to cross Conan Hall from the Statue Square, which is up here, to Star Ferry, you can see there was a tunnel already planned there. And this is, of course, a larger set of relationships that is very, very visible in Central in relation, of course, to the extensive MTR tunnel system that also was put in place in the early 80s. Where the ground is broken up by traffic, tunnels and bridges began to fill in. And this is, of course, what makes Hong Kong Central also spectacularly famous for urbanists around the world. This is the only place in the world where these things work simply because of the density. So we can see on the left, the tunnels, the right, the set of bridges, and this area where there are no bridges and only some of the tunnels coming in is a patch, a very rare patch where actually the ground is working very well. Another glimpse to go to the City Gallery, which is on the side of the City Hall from the eastern end. Instead of taking the tunnel, you can also take this bridge that gets it used to go through Hutchinson House, which is this building here. But of course, Hutchinson House, which was studied only 2 years ago, is no longer with us also. Another kind of very real view, these transit spaces are actually on weekends also places for rest and gatherings in a city where space is, of course, very, very scarce. These places that are public, that are shared, that are in a way are commons, are, of course, in addition to the more formally designed plazas and parks that already take place. So we have the set of present conditions that we are in today. It's in itself is very much in an interim state. And with the students, of course, we were asking what are the plans for this byproduct of infrastructural priorities? What is the future? We began to look at the future that were the kind of, the guidelines for designing this future. And it was, for example, very obvious that the importance of the parking compels or necessitates the demolition of the GPO, for example. So you can see kind of a student's analysis of what would come if it were to be realized and why it's much easier to just tear down buildings in order to make this happen. What kind of urban face? Of course, we're really talking about the face of Hong Kong, right? What the future show to the world. The future urban face, of course, would be designed in consideration of the forms and the massing materialities, and of course, in addition, the functions of this place. So we saw earlier that capital, of course, manifests itself in the taut, shiny facades that take place. So is this what kind of face we would like to present to the world? We have, at least in the academy, the luxury of dreaming a bit of other possible futures, to think that this is not the only possible future that needs to take place here. And we tried very much in the two studios, looking closely at the site to break down their elements. It was interesting when we were discussing and kind of making models at various scales that one of the students took this blue foam, which represented one version of the future, according to the planning guidelines, and said, did they not make a model of this? Did they not look at this? Because if you looked at this huge blue foam mass, we put it on the existing structures, we'll see how massive it is. We know there's an adage from a lot of planning departments, especially from the developing part of the world, that bigger is better. But that question should be tabled again in relation to the future of this place. The other thing that we can see, of course, is that the intents for this blue massing is, of course, for a lot of commercial programs rather than public programs. So you can see from this outsized, it is much larger than, for example, the existing City Hall, not to mention the GPO itself. So the urban face of the Hong Kong, the City Hall building and the GPO is an ensemble, the realities of the infrastructure and developmental priorities, and within all of this, is the civic still possible here? If you had visited our exhibition in 2018 summer at the PMQ open space, you would have seen that some of the students did design with much care and precision alternative futures. And within this, of course, a version of reuse adaptation of the GPO was there amongst the other ideas. So I hope some of those students can also keep on going and contribute to this open call. That would be really wonderful. So I end on a few words that I think is very important in thinking about this place, this notion of a public. Public, and not in the sense of that the land is owned by the state and then done with it with certain kinds of decision making, but the sense that there is something that is shared by all of us, this notion, this common, and the idea of that, of course, in relation to society, especially in thinking the possible functions that could come into this new future. So with that, I would like to, of course, thank all the students who were part of this kind of exercise, this kind of research. And I would like to also think about it as a little bit of dreaming from where we are of what could be for this place. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zhou. Next, we have Katie Lau, one of the founders of the Central and Western Concern Group. She'll be speaking about the role of heritage and culture in the vicinity of Site 3 and the value it offers to Hong Kong today. So, Katie?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yes, good. Thank you, Tiffany ULI for inviting me to be a speaker today. And thank you, Ying, for sharing so much of the, the information about the site and Central. Perhaps I would take around 5 to 10 minutes to share with everyone the various conservation efforts by the civil society in the past 10 to 15 years in around Central. And I hope that through this sharing and to provide a perspective to everyone that really the public participation in conservation really helps to bring about a sense of place and a sense of belonging in the society. And since I'm a member of the Central and Western Concern Group, so a couple of these projects where we also involved in a couple of these projects in Central, I would start from the year about 2005, 2006, when Star Ferry and Queen's Pier were under threat and eventually being demolished due to the reclamation program. And I'm sure that many of you will remember that time because the two incidents really sparked a new wave of conservation awareness in the society. We certainly, felt so strongly about, the importance of conserving our heritage. And we are also very touched by the fact that so many people joined this movement. And somehow, right, in Central, at the very place of in front of City Hall, there are, so many discussions about why we would like to conserve our heritage and why it is so important for us. So I had joined in, some of those discussions, and they really inspired me and made me feel, that conservation of our heritage is something that we all need to take part in. So from then on, there are several projects in Central which we are involved in, including the conservation of the Hollywood Road Police Quarters, the one that we call the PMQ today, from a sales site that we are, the civil society managed to turn it into a conservation site. Also the Central Market, there are, wide discussion about the Central Market, whether, it should be turned into a commercial site or whether it should be conserved. And just recently, the conservation works have been finished, and we are looking forward to see a new Central Market coming up by the end of this year. Also Tai Kwun, which is the Central Police headquarters and the Victoria Prison, also a site which was quite controversial at the time in 2005. Government was thinking whether to grant it to a developer at that time. But eventually, all these three sites, the PMQ, Central Market, and Tai Kwun, were being conserved and now turned into really nice public space and buildings for institutional use and community use. I'm sure the conservation of these three sets of civic buildings and three civic sites really bring about a change in the face of Central. So aside from being a very commercial district, we now have a sense of history, a sense of the belonging to this site because we have conserved these historical sites. So added to that, we also had the conservation of the former central government offices, the West Wing, which was designated to be sold, demolished, and developed into a commercial tower, was finally decided to be conserved. Thanks to the efforts of various groups, civil society groups, we managed to change the government's mind. So I guess right now, we come back to the General Post Office, which are facing a rather uncertain future, because in the sale of Site 3, the government, although there is a two-envelope process that give more importance to the design of this project, it's not specifically laid out that the General Post Office should be preserved. There's no specific detail in that tender document, has not been mentioned. And also it's a bit disappointing for us that the General Post Office, which is in my mind a very iconic and important modernist architecture, has not been graded in our grading process because of its age. The buildings right now, according to government's policies, buildings which was built after the 1970 will not be graded because of its age. And that, I think, is a little bit absurd, because I think all over the world, important modernist buildings, even younger than this, would be treasured by the people. So I guess what we have right now, we have a two-envelope process, and that encourages designers and developers to think about more elements of design and hopefully conservation. And I hope that more efforts and thoughts could be given to the preservation of this important building. And I think, well, I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about the General Post Office. As Ying has said, together, the GPO together with the City Hall is very much an ensemble. And I would add that we also have at the back of it, Statue Square, and also the Edinburgh Place. In fact, if our designers and the developers could think about all these together as a civic space, and maybe there could be some, a really interesting design to bring this all together. And of course, we could also think about the car park right next to the GPO and the City Hall, which is also a very interesting building, as well as, in fact, it was the first multi-story car park in Hong Kong. So all these actually linked together because of its history. And by keeping this in mind when designing Site 3, I think these heritage buildings will, bring, much interest to the new components of Site 3, kind of, using these heritage buildings to link up the old and the new, and to bring about, a better sense of place in the new development, rather than wiping them out and create something totally new. There are so many examples all over the world in protecting historic civic buildings, and even especially the old post office. The GPO is now the only General Post Office left in Hong Kong. It is the last of it. if the developer decided to knock down the GPO, we won't have any more GPO left in all of Hong Kong. I think we really have to keep this in mind. So I'm very glad that 3 teams of architects has spent the last few months thinking about, how to maybe how to preserve this important building, or how to integrate the historic to the new. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their presentation, and to see what they could spark in the coming few months. After I posted the Facebook page about this event, in fact, I received inquiries from members of the public already. I think she may be a student, and she asked me if this open call would be open for students to join. I'm sure we can allow that, right? And let me finish here, and all the best to the presentation, and I'm looking forward to listening to these ideas, and hopefully these discussions would also attract the attentions of our developers or our government, that they could listen to our ideas as well. Thank you very much.
So thank you for that very heartfelt sharing, Katie. So it's clear that heritage and conservation mean a lot to Hong Kongers, and it's something they'll fight to keep for present and future generations. So hopefully we'll have some innovative approaches to achieving that. Earlier, we shared 3 key themes identified by the public as important to Site 3. Now, we're going to have examples of design proposals for the area that respond to those very themes, which were civic programming, access and connectivity, and heritage and culture. And these are coming from a trio of very exciting architecture firms in Hong Kong. So first, we'll have Architecture Commons with Rick Lam and Eric Ho. Then Original Vision with Ricky Liu and Adrian McCarroll. And finally, Charles Lai from Aona Architects will each be sharing a proposal for the Site 3 area.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, ULI, and thank you for the presentations by Ying and the chat by Katie. We're excited to be one of the 3 teams to share our very initial kind of thoughts about our proposal. We're Architecture Commons. I'm with my partner Rick Lam here. We're an architecture and urban sort of strategy firm, and we're very interested in all the topics that were mentioned, civic programming, public spaces. How do we create kind of architecture and urban spaces that respond to the needs of citizens? I'm going to go into a bit of our kind of idea, and then we hope that this is more kind of a process. And I think what we're trying to do here is, by participating in this, is also kind of engage with people and engage with comments, and would love to kind of hear more of your feedback on what we're kind of working on. The first thing that we want to say about Central is there's a lot of public spaces actually, but a lot of them are quite fragmented and not sort of connected, which I think Ying has sort of talked about that earlier, where there's some disconnection, maybe by highways, by different kind of elements. So I think that's sort of one thing that we started to notice is one of the pain points. And then the other is what is civic program, and what has happened to civic programs. And I think what Ying also echoing what she was saying, there was a public phase back in the 1960s when City Hall was built, and there was a very kind of deliberate intent of having that at a very prominent space in the city. What we've observed sort of down the road is there's the Shangwan Civic Center, which is a very typical kind of vertical building. Then obviously we have what Katie was mentioning, kind of a trio of, Taikoo and Central Market and PMQ kind of in succession. And I think those are really encouraging, but I think there's still kind of a larger kind of question of what is civic programs and what is civic space for Central. Now, obviously, this was just taken, I think, two weekends ago. What are happening to our kind of public spaces? Where why do we have these areas where we should be supporting sort of these inclusive programs, but there's fences, there's all these kind of informal activities, there's deliveries happening. Can we sort of help and support sort of these kind of things in our spaces? How can we think about informality and formality in a more inclusive way? And obviously, right now around the site, it's quite undefined. There's, lots of public space, but it's like question mark, question mark, question mark. How do you get to it? What is going on there? What's happening around there? A lot of undefined spaces. So, typical to a lot of our projects, what we look at is there's a couple of issues that we identify: fragmented open spaces, lack of civic programs, informal activities, and undefined open spaces. But these are also all opportunities that we can base our design on. How do we facilitate integration of open spaces for different types of activities? How can we consult different stakeholders, bring them into the fold to kind of look at what civic programming needs are? Can we build support spaces for some of these informal activities, right? Can we kind of transform some of these open spaces and streetscapes into something that is for the many? And then last but not least is how do we provide open spaces with varieties of spatial definitions, so we can create that sort of civic face that or civic sort of presence that is still kind of, we think, lacking in the neighborhood of a very important neighborhood of Central. So how might we encourage informal uses and cultivate a diversity of civic programming with visibility and easy accessibility? There's a lot of public spaces in Hong Kong that are very, very inaccessible. For example, on top of podiums that there's no elevator to access, right? How do we create a melting pot of new civic spaces that can allow citizens of different needs, abilities to create, meet, and mingle and play? How can we establish an identity that is for public space that respect culture, heritage, and also actually most importantly, to continue reappropriation of it according to the needs of community? How can a space be flexible and be available to accommodate these needs? We've done a lot of research in different neighborhoods, actually, like in Wan Chai, where there's sort of qualities of public space where there's a lot of synergy of adjacent programming. In this case, it's a commercial adjacency of a coffee shop, becomes a really vibrant space. This one is example of Belcher Bay Harbourfront, where there's a very experimental approach of like creating extremely flexible and experimental play with different kinds of audience. Obviously, Tuen Mun Park, which is quoted so many times around inclusive play. But also, how do we bring in sort of technology and different kinds of interaction into the fold? So with our planning strategy, we know the site is challenging in many fronts, a lot of different roadways, a lot of activities that actually need to happen on the first floor instead of the ground floor. So the plane condition needs to be very much defined. How do we actually connect while the site is actually quite disconnected? So our initial strategy is 6 of them. One is, echoing kind of the planning principles, is to strengthen the access to waterfront. We want to push kind of this massing to one side to really create room for sort of the civic landscape. And then responding to kind of the heritage component, how do we use sort of the back of the site to address GPO, City Hall, and that whole complex at the back? How do we create leisure for the public, and how do we create such a kind of unique site creates sort of a viewing and a sort of an amenity for the public in the front. Obviously, the adaptive reuse of the heritage, so really looking at GPO as a very integral component. The Star Ferry clock tower, which I assume they will bring back somehow. How do we sort of respect that? And obviously the extension of the waterfront. How do we create a plane that can really interact and relate to the waterfront? And lastly, kind of how do we look at the peripheral? How do we activate the streetscapes on the edge to allow for these sort of informal civic ways of activating the kind of public space happen? So we have sort of two strategies. One is kind of a plain idea, and one is kind of a void idea. And Rick is going to walk you through that.
Right. So we have prepared two ideas as of now. The first idea is what we call slope commons. So what we envision here is actually a series of wedges. So these are large urban forms that aims to bring people, from multiple levels, namely from the south side, from the basement, I guess, the connection with the NTR, up to the podium level, and further up to, let's say, the higher massing towards the west side, closer to IFC. Hong Kong's development a lot of times, fall victim to the development pressure, and it's never sort of like realized fully to the architectural potential that it could have. And in here, we are interested in exploring the idea of a larger urban form. So in here, the wedges sort of underlines the entire development of Central, and in doing so, creating a kind of continuity that is immediately iconic. It creates a unmistakable sort of landmark at this very precious Site 3 of Central. And the other idea that is very important to us is that the Site 3 development is not entirely sort of contained within the boundary. So it exerts sort of its influences across to the lots on the north, and also to the east side as well. So here you can see how do we envision the programming of these wedges. And like what Eric mentioned before, we think that the massing that is closer to the south side has a better relationship with City Gallery and with the GPO. So the programming there probably will be more civic oriented. And with this particular scheme, the slope on the top of these wedges are all meant to be accessible. So it opens up a lot more opportunities for the kind of urban experiences that has a very good relationship with the harbour views. And then, of course, we never forget about the symbiotic relationship between commerce and civic. So going forward, we understand that the importance of how the two, will be driving circulation for each other, and the success of one is really reliant on the success of the other. So I'm not going to go too detailed into the circulation. I think we are all pretty familiar with the site and site forces. And so this is what we meant by the zoning of civic program. So closer to the City Gallery and GPO will be the cultural and heritage program. In the middle, the leisure zone will also include, I guess, the main chunk of the commercial zone. So by definition, it is a bit more inward looking, and it supports, I guess, the play and leisure functions here. And then finally, closer to the waterfront, it is the more outward looking viewing deck functions. In here, from the bottom up, you'll see that these are programming that we envision to be important. Well, of course, we very much think that this is a process, and then we need to engage with the public to really define exactly what is necessary. But for example, the idea of performance, of theater, of a very important dimension of food, of multifunctional civic programs, exhibition spaces. And one idea that we really were very excited about for the GPO is perhaps it could be a larger sort of entrance hall, one that is very much akin to, let's say, the Turbine Hall of Tate Modern. It would be an amazing space with, with history that cannot be just replicated. It has to be something that is written in history, like the GPO. So like I said, the leisure zone, has different activities. In here, we are suggesting play and sports. and it complements with the commercial activities that is, again, by definition, more inward looking in the middle of the plot. And then on the waterfront side, we are kind of pretty obsessed with this idea of the infinity pool that is facing the piers. And then at the same time, we wanted this portion to open up towards the pier, like what we've shown at the bottom here, the pier plaza, that could, inform the experience of, the ferry piers crossing Victoria Harbour. So that was the slope common scheme, and then our second scheme has to do with the idea of yards. So in here, we are creating a second scheme that is less formal, but one that is more responsive to the civic open spaces that would be required on the site. So for example, in here, you'll see that there are a number of spaces, one that is closer and more complementary to City Hall. There's an open space that is supporting the clock tower. There's an open space that is immediately to the north of GPO. There's a capsule-shaped open plaza that is suggesting a connection with the eastern lot, next to Site 3, and also a figure ground relationship with the pier plaza that is informed by the northwest, sort of northeast facing open steps that perhaps would be informed by outdoor performances, etc. So the figure ground relationship of all these open spaces inform the architectural statement of the scheme. And for example, the formal language is more akin to the modernist towards the south near the City Hall. It becomes a bit more organic as we move towards the amenities and civic programs on the north side. So very similarly, like what I said before, the figure ground relationship informs how these open spaces are mixed with the commercial program. And of course, the plazas also infiltrate into the commerce and the office towers towards the west side, closer to IFC. And these are important connections as well. Like what we are showing on this diagram, the different sight lines and the connections are also fulfilled in this scheme very clearly. Similar zoning like we have shown before. And on this scheme, you'll see that the civic programs are complemented by two large plazas. And again, we have exhibition programs, we have courtyards, we have galleries and studios and exhibition spaces. And incubation program inside the GPO is what we're suggesting for the scheme here. Leisure programs, again, inform the middle part of development. And one important idea is the commerce, and for example, alfresco dining is happening here on the rooftop. And again, the north part is opening up towards the open spaces on the north side and also towards the piers. So that is the end of our two schemes. One that is a little bit more formally driven, and the second one that is more responsive to the civic programs that we're envisioning along this swath of very impressive and important development coming to Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Ricky and Eric. Rick and Eric. Next, we'll have Original Vision and Ricky and Adrian.
Okay, just let me share our screen. This one here. Okay, is everybody seeing this PDF? All good, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody else. Ying, Katie, Eric and Rick, that was very good work and very good introduction to where we're coming from. It actually covers a lot of the background that we have been using to generate our ideas. So it thankfully means we don't need to represent that kind of information. We do have one brief bit of analysis to present, which is a little bit of what we are trying to connect, because our request was to come up with how we make this site more connected with the rest of Hong Kong, because it is, as we've just discovered, a very much an isolated and non-connected piece of Hong Kong. So if I hand you over to Ricky, he is going to lead you through a little bit of the heritage, a little bit of the areas that we're trying to connect together.
So you all can see that the diagrams we've done to highlight the modern heritage, what we call historical urban landscape. The brown one in the middle of the diagrams highlighted the like a seven shapes actually emphasize the collection of modern heritage around this old central and also the new central part that coming into the waterfront edges. There's a lot of building that is built post World War II period from 1950 to around 1979, including the GPO multi-story car park, City Hall, Jardine House that is more relevant to the site-free context. Let me, within this historical images, you can see that the first connectivity we want to celebrate is the heritage or the historical character that is embodied inside Edinburgh Place, and also the extension from Statue Square to the waterfront areas. In the top left, you can see that back pier that is already lost in 2000 during the reclamation time. That also including the City Hall roof promenade is one of the features that you once was a highlight inside the Edinburgh Place and the waterfront pier. The second important character is the elevated walkway that coming through the landmark, starting from the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. That is the first one in Hong Kong. The other one is, it was previously ceremonial place, including where the Queen's Pier City Hall that celebrating the British government inauguration and also the arrival of the Queen. Also including the war memorial that is inside the Statue Square and the City Hall. In the second part, we will want to tell you the physical connectivity from the underground, upper ground, and etc. I will hand it back to Andrew.
Okay, we're just keeping an eye on our time here. So I'll move straight into essentially looking at what the connectivity, and we are put together a scheme, which is really a briefing scheme that takes a program and puts it all together in the one scheme for Site 3. So this is an overall plan. The yellow is the connectivity that we are trying to connect. So as you can see, from Hong Kong Island, from Hong Kong Central here itself, there's a couple of links that run through. They already go down towards the ferry piers, but it's a fairly tenuous link. There's a couple of accesses off into IFC and off into Exchange Square, but they are pretty much dead ends, as it were, apart from the routing through to the ferry pier. So what we're trying to do is create a network, a multi-layered network within the site itself, to try and make more connection between the underground, the double underground, the at ground, and the above ground facilities that we have available to us. So what we have here is the connectivity with the second basement MTR connection. So what we're doing is bringing Central Station, bringing the two Central Station locations together and focusing it in on this site, so that we're actually creating a ring around which pedestrians can roam underground, and that will create far more, generate far more footfall for all of the retail that is underground. Am I missing something here? Oh, okay. Plans proposal. All right, go down to the very basement. The North Island line runs through the site. Either side of that, we're proposing to have two level 3 basement car parking areas, and then an underground mall on the other part of the site that we have available. Coming up, this is at basement 2. This is where we connect through with the MTR, Central Station, Hong Kong Station, and create that ring loop around. This is 2 floors underground, so this is very much a special case. But our mall, the green, goes down into that space. Coming up to basement 1, this is where we connect through to Statue Square with the existing tunnel that comes through and brings us up into a sunken plaza, and that then carries on through another tunnel through to an underground mall on the other side, and then it comes up another level to the upper level, which is ground floor level. So we've got 2 sunken pits, as it were, which are sunken mall. So that leaves open to the sky. And then this brings us up to the central mall and a central open space with the GPO being used as the GPO with its relationship with Jardine House. But then the most connected location is on the above ground, the first floor level. And this is where the view through from Hong Kong Bank has been maintained, and where we have a network of connectivity taking us all the way through to the Star Ferry piers, taking us back through IFC Mall in 2 locations, taking us back to Exchange Square, taking us on to Site 4, which in itself is going to be an exciting development, and across into Sites 1 and 2, and they will in themselves be exciting developments, and they can then loop back to IFC Mall. So as you can see, what we're trying to do is make these connections very tangible and very strong. And as you see, we've made the main one from Star Ferry back up into Central, as it were, coming through and passing by the GPO. Above the GPO, above the first floor level, we're taking it up another level here. And it was interesting what Eric and Rick were talking about, using podium spaces as public spaces, and that's what we're looking at doing here, is using these rooftops, which don't have separate vertical circulation access, as public spaces, much the same as the public space on the upper floor and the podium level of IFC has been used. Then on the upper level, we're essentially changing the usage to office space, and that takes us all the way up to the top floor. In terms of massing, I'll notice I've only got a couple of minutes left. The massing, this really gives a better impression of the connectivity, because sometimes in those diagrams, the plan diagrams, they seem to get broken and you don't see the connectivity, but here you can see it coming through MTR, Statue Square, coming through into the site. They come together in a mall, and then they go under the road again and come together in a secondary mall, and then they come up for their final transit across the Star Ferry. At the higher level, the route comes through is a covered route on the other side, covered route that comes all the way through and takes you all the way to Central, covered, undercover. So we have an open loop on one side and a covered loop on the other. This is looking back from essentially the Hong Kong Bank, looking down through, and as you can see, it becomes very much a network of connectivity. We have reintroduced some heritage sites. We've got the Star Ferry, the Queen's Pier in this location. We have the clock tower. Interesting to see that Rick and Eric had it in probably the same location. And then we've got the GPO on this side here. The GPO has been repurposed with the post office in the ground floor, 4 floors, and then we've got 2 floors of office space in the existing fabric of the building above the GPO. So if we look from the ocean or from the harbour, we've got the ferry piers, and as you can see, that network almost like a spider's web of connectivity back through into Central, but also into all of the exciting sites that are happening on either side of it, with IFC on the right there, then sites 1 and 2 here, and site 4 in here. And finally, a view more from the west, and it shows how similarly to Rick and Eric, we've got our massing, which has essentially been forced by the planning requirements on the west side, and then the view corridor from Hong Kong Bank on the east side creates a fairly exciting connectivity opportunity linked together with retail. So, as I mentioned about the planning, we've got quite a lot of diagrammatic planning information available, which we can share with all the participants, so that it means that they don't have to look into things in so much detail, which we've tried to condense them down and distill them down into a little bit more usable and legible guidance diagrams. So as I said, we'll be very happy to share them with all the participants. So that really brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for the time and your attention, and apologies for running over by 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much.
And then I think we have our final presentation from the architects.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles, and I'm from the AONA Architects. I myself is an architect and a researcher in architectural history of Hong Kong. Before I start, one thing that I think I should take the liberty to remind the panelists and the audience is that the way how the three teams works together is not so much like a architectural competition. I know it may sound like we are competing against each other, but in fact we set off in very early on that it is first of all not an architectural competition. And secondly, we try to focus within our own areas of expertise, or we start the project from our own area of expertise. So that is the reason why you will see that the three teams takes on a probably slightly different approaches. But then the interesting thing is that there will be a lot of overlappings. I think one of the reasons for that is because those are probably the most logical direction to go for. I should start because we are bit running out of time. So yes, the starting point of our project is from a historical and cultural approach, and trying to look at how we can use the historical and cultural context as to inform the future potential conservation of the GPO. And I think one of the issues that come up quite frequently around the discussion of the GPO is that on one side we want to strike for the conservation of the building, but then on the other side we also need to provide the a GFA, the floor area that is part of the site 3. So we, besides looking at the historical and cultural context of the project, we also try to ask ourselves, does it really make sense to keep the GPO in terms of the in terms of the calculation of floor areas, in terms of the sellable floor areas? And secondly, if we decide to conserve the GPO, what would be the architectural what would be the architectural potential it offers. And then we look into how we can resolve some of the issues with architectural proposals. So first of all, a bit of a background research of the GPO. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. The GPO, since the beginning, it has been a cultural icon that signifies the modern culture and modern era of Hong Kong. This is actually a set design of the the Mighty Peking Man movie in 1977, just 1 year after the GPO opened its door. You can see that the model makers are building a huge model so that they can shoot this scene where the Mighty Peking Man climbs up to the top of the giant house and then fall down, so that it's the sort of mighty ending scene of that movie. It also serves as, of course, like Rick and Eric has said, and also, of course, the other team has said, it is a background for a lot of the historical ceremonies. It together with the Queen's Pier and the Edinburgh Plaza, it carries a certain historical values. And these are some old images that we have digged up from the archives. And then the one on the right is quite interesting because that is actually the original plan for the GPO. The GPO was never designed to be a 6 or 7 story building like the one we have today. In the original proposal, it was supposed to be like a 20-story high government office with a huge podium that houses the concourse for the staff area as well. But it was due to the negotiations between the Hong Kong Land and the Hong Kong government that the GPO, the government decided to lower the building mass of the GPO to only 6 floors. So the first thing which we were trying to look at is to, as I said, look at the floor areas. What are the floor areas that is set off in the site free tender? How much floor area do they expect the developer to provide, and to see whether or not it's really necessary to demolish the GPO, or whether it's possible to just convert the interiors of the GPO into other uses. And maybe next to that, we can build some more additional GFAs. And then the, I might jump ahead a little bit, sorry. And I will talk about the outcome of that research a bit later. But before we do that, we try to look at the building mass of the GPO. It's actually quite a huge building. It's almost comparable to the whole compound of the Asian Society. In fact, it is almost as big as the compound of the Tycoon. So when we go to Tycoon, we'll see that it has a huge courtyard surrounded by all these beautiful historical buildings. The floor area of the GPO is actually similar to that. And this is in comparison to the Mills and some other foreign, some other examples overseas as well. So this is the result of the research. A small sort of brief, very quick calculation we took. in terms of the GFA. And the result is that it of course depends on how much GFA are there outside of the GPO itself. But technically, when we give it a sort of a more reasonable guess, it seems that we only need to add a little bit of GFA to the existing GPO in order to fulfill the sort of requirement or the allowable of GFAs in the site frame. So based on that, we try to come up with a architectural solution or architectural we try to look at the architectural possibility of, first of all, keeping the GPO and then adding some masses around or next to the GPO. So in essence, this is the amount of floor area that we will need to add to the existing GPO. This is not our proposals, don't worry. So we look at a lot of massing possibilities. And then the one thing that we find out, which is quite interesting, is that the facade that we see, the outlook of the GPO today, especially when we look at it from the north side, that is not the original appearance of the GPO. When the GPO was first built, it was built in front of the Victoria Harbour. It has a promenade running across the whole length of the facade. It is not just a promenade, it is actually a three-story structure that houses exclusive docks to the interior of the GPO as well, so that boats carrying the mails can come into this structure, and then there are cranes that would take the mails and postages into the building itself. But then the southern facade, when we look at the buildings from the southern side, is more or less still keeping the same outlook. Now, the picture on the right-hand side is what I was talking about. You will see that there is a promenade structure running across the whole entire length of the facade, and you will see the boats parking into this openings underneath the promenade. There are actually cranes that would carry the postage, the mails to the mails and the parcels into the GPO. So this is another image of that. And the what we have found out is that when we look at the GPO today, it doesn't have this kind of connection to the water anymore, obviously because of the reclamation. But then it's also because of the fact that they after the reclamation, the level difference between the sea level and the land, it's close off. So what we are proposing is that what if we try to recreate that condition and propose almost like a new way of looking back to the northern facade of the GPO, but that new angle is obviously the old angle that you will see from the boats if you're on the on Victoria Harbour. So this is the first strategy that we want to propose. What if we lower the ground by 1 or 2 levels, and so that first of all we will gain a sunken plaza, and as I said, you will have you will almost regain that lowered viewpoint that was on the sea level before the reclamation happened. But of course, beside that, you will gain some GFA because of the underground structures as well. And then we try to ask ourselves, what if then we try to recreate that promenade structure as well, so that we can resolve those additional GFA that we might need to put onto the GFA, the GPO. And then by doing that, we will be able to create a lot more different access point into the interior spaces of the GPO. The current access point for the public mainly is from the southern side of the GPO. But then in order for the GPO, the interior space for the GPO to be open to the public, we want to propose more access points so that people can get into the building from multiple approaches. So these are some of the programs that are still we're still drafting. But then one of the main point that I want to bring out is that there is a possibility of putting a exhibition space, almost like a postal museum, in one of the levels of the GPO, so that that is also the reason why we want to create multiple access points into the interior of the GPO, so that it could inhabit multiple programs. And these are some of the very rough renderings that we have made to trying to simulate what would be the appearance of the GPO after we have recreate this historical promenade structure. And also what would happen if we open up the existing atriums that is already in the GPO now, meaning that what if we turned the top few levels, which is currently currently houses the offices in the GPO, what if we open them up and turn it into some sort of a exhibition postal museum spaces, and this would be the public level of the GPO. Also, you'll see that because of the connection with the new massings, with new portion, there could be some openings that could provide visual or pedestrian connections between the old building and the new portions and the new massing as well. So yes, this will be our presentation. Hope that I'm not overrunning. I overrun.
Great, thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to each of these three teams who have taken on a different spin to the development of Site 3 and done it in a way that responds to public priorities and also promotes the idea that such a project should benefit the people of Hong Kong. I think at the end of the day, the goal of this initiative is really to spark discussion about Site 3 and get people talking, right? To broaden the conversation from commercial or financial issues to also encompass the things that the public really cares about, right? Whether it's things that the public and the civic groups themselves have actually highlighted as important to them. So whether it's walkability, free to use spaces, or keeping the unique heritage feature of the GPO, I think these are things that civic groups and members of the public have themselves raised. So I think we should clarify too that this is not a design competition. It's a conversation starter, a way for the public to register its interest and for anyone to share ideas, aspirations, and priorities. And so to the folks in the audience then, if your interest is piqued, did want to make clear that there's absolutely no need for you to have the same refined drawings that the firms have made. What's most important is that your concept or your story is made clear, because someone I think had asked, are students welcome to share ideas? And they most definitely are welcome to join this conversation. And ultimately, I think it's important that in such a critical civic process, the public does have an opportunity to be heard, and that there is some transparency and openness. So, by opening up this platform to the grassroots, all of us in this coalition really do hope it's an invitation to take part. And this coalition does believe we can have a community conversation about how to treat Site 3 and make it work for all Hong Kongers. So then, we'll talk very briefly then about some of the logistics for how people can join this conversation. So I'm just going to share my screen. So if you go to the website newcentral.org, this is kind of a hub for some of the information related to Site 3 and kind of this conversation that we're hoping to spark related to its development and various proposals. And so as you can see, kind of this is an ongoing discussion. It's a way of collecting ideas for the future in an open call. Today, we did have this Spark Salon to kind of start helping people think through some of the issues. The 3 key themes that were identified by the public are here. You can read a bit more about them. We've also provided some resources from the field for you to consult if you are interested in learning more about Site 3 and what's happening there. And then we also have this open call for ideas, what will be useful or required, at least, if you want to make a submission to this kind of community effort. And so for the first part, it's images you could submit to help tell your story or communicate your concept. The one requirement is that if you could make 3 A1 boards, landscape format, please save them as PDFs, but you yourself can figure out how you would like to put those images together. There are some other suggested items that could be quite useful for the folks who are kind of be looking at and evaluating these. And then other drawings and other types of multimedia could also be helpful as you try to communicate your story. So that's kind of the image part of this. The text part, it'd be really, really helpful if you have explanatory text that answers the following questions about your design. And so you can look on the website newcentral.org to kind of look at which one of the themes you're responding to, how is public benefit addressed by your idea, how is connection to kind of the surrounding area, broader applicability of what you're thinking about, and then your team background. So again, you can find more out about this, and then you can always, after you've pulled your package together, you can submit online using this submit button. The timeline for this, so this open call has been launched. The Spark Salon is today. You have several weeks then to think about ideas you'd like to submit. And then after you turn them in by April 24th, I think we're calling them, perhaps like the strongest ideas or the ideas that the panel of evaluators might find most compelling. But I wanted to point out too that it was really important that we have a public celebration of all of the ideas, because I think everyone's contribution to this platform, everything that comes through in this process is worthy of being celebrated and is part of the public conversation around what's happening to Site 3 in Hong Kong. And so kind of the endpoint really is a celebration of all of the ideas. Okay, and then here's the different project organizers. So hopefully that was helpful to understand the logistics of this. Please do go to newcentral.org if you want to read in more detail or download any of the files. Now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cecilia Chu, and she is the president of Docomomo Hong Kong, which stands for Documentation and Conservation of the Modern Movement. She's also an associate professor in the Division of Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, and she trained as an urban historian with a background in design and conservation. Cecilia?
Great, thank you, Kevin, and thanks everyone for being here. And I want to, well, because I think that probably the audience, they would like to make a lot of comments, I will make mine a little bit short and raise some questions. So first of all, thanks for the 3 presenters for presenting to us these exciting ideas. I really appreciate each of them provided some framing for us. You know, these are not really detailed design, but hopefully also those, the presentations give us really the kind of considerations for the project. For architectural comments, I think that that's thanks to Rick and Eric for outlining some of the important concepts of basically the three areas of connectivities and programming and also cultural heritage. And for original vision, that the connectivity part was very much articulated within the current fabric. And I think that's, hopefully that's give us some really good idea. And Charles, about the importance of heritage, especially the GPO, that really outlines the kind of heritage relationships, the past and the future of the site. So I think these are very useful. But I would like to maybe just return a little bit to what Ying started with the presentation about the idea of civicness and civic space, which I think is an overarching framework for all of us to think about. And as an urban historian, what I would always, when I think about the Site 3, I would ask the questions of how these spatial relationships, how the spatial relationship relates to the forms, how the forms of these fabrics relate to the processes that shape them. So when we think about this, we need to ask about what kind of processes are we talking about? The economic processes, the historical processes, the different kinds of urban processes that come into shaping this overall Site 3. And how does Site 3 relates to these sort of larger contexts around them? And in that sense, what does that mean for civicness in Hong Kong, and what kind of new relationships we try to create? If we think about relationships, again, we also want to talk about the experiential relations, the new relationships that in association with the old, and what kind of values and meanings that we want to inscribe onto these forms. What kind of values and meanings have already been inscribed to them by different kinds of people. So I think that might open up a little bit of a wider way of relating to the sites, to think beyond the forms, but also think about how these forms can create new social relationships that we want to see. So that's I think that's the kind of overall comments on how the sites can be meaningful for us. The other comments, I think that the three presenters haven't really addressed as much, and I find might be interesting is to think about the sort of sustainable relation in the future, Site 3 at the waterfront, and ideas probably also about climate change and the kind of landscapes that we want creating around these sites, how the buildings relating to their landscapes, and how might that feed back to this sort of ideas of informality and formality of activities that we want to create. So I think that's, and then also the commercial and the non-commercial, the symbolic and the everyday, different types of stakeholders. So I think that is maybe some of the larger questions that I have. I think a lot of the questions have already been addressed by the presenters, and kind of using these as framing questions to help us as we think about what does Site 3, how can Site 3 allow us to create a better sense of civic space in the 21st century. So shall we maybe open up for some questions and we can discuss for further discussions. Kevin, would you maybe, we can facilitate some questions from the audience?
Okay, sure. Thanks for those comments, Cecilia, Professor Chu. I think the one of the questions from the audience right now was actually is for Dr. Zhou, who unfortunately did have to step out, but she was talking about kind of the student presentations in 2018. I think she was asking, did one of them stand out more favorably, or what elements did it consist of, and what was more desirable? But maybe Professor Chi, you could also take this just to think about, like, when you do work with students, when you are kind of doing this civic engagement with the students, how do you help them kind of navigate this issue? And then therefore, how do they produce designs? Like, how does engagement help them produce designs that are, I guess, as this question asks, desirable?
Desirable.
Open to anyone else, yeah, as well.
I remember when Ying was introduced in the studio, she put a lot of emphasis in the exploratory process in the beginning, because what is desirable is not the desirability of the designers. But for a public space like this, we really need to understand the different desires. And sometimes we need to think about contradictions as well, because there are different, maybe contradictory values, multiple users. So I guess that in the students project, we have the luxuries to explore these kind of contradictions and to really do some sort of ethnography to explore some of the contradictory functions and maybe the economics process, the economic processes that are in contradictions with what we want to do with what we want to create for public spaces that is non-commercial. So some of these were I think the conflicts, it's very important in part of the exploratory stages. Maybe we can open up the for the panelists as well to contribute to some comments on each other. I think that might be useful.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask a question to the three teams? Really, they're really interesting in their own way. And I just want to know, from now on to the end of April, are the three teams planning to further work on their designs and proposals? And how are they going to further work on their designs and proposals? I'm quite interested to know a bit more their thinking with regarding to their their designs. Okay, that's my question to the three teams.
Eric, do you want to get us started? And then after that, Ricky's team, and then Charles.
Yes. So I think thank you for actually I do want to respond to Cecilia's comment just now, because I think as we do a lot of kind of, I guess, observations and as part of our work, as we're really big on kind of how do we engage different communities and audience as we sort of develop our design. And one thing that we noticed that was really interesting is how, when we're even just 2 weeks ago looking at Chatter Street, there's a lot of kind of actually economic activities like packing, goods and sort of shipping goods. And I think there's a very interesting kind of, maybe as you're saying, a kind of contradiction, right? Like at the most kind of expensive kind of real estate in Central, there's a lot of these informal activities that are supporting, kind of these ethnic minorities, and can't help but kind of think, GPO as a post office, right? The kind of function of shipping, right across, the aisle, on Chatter Street, and that just all out on the street, kind of doing shipping. And so I think as we're, and Rick, please kind of fill in, as we're kind of developing our design, I think a lot of these we'll kind of want to continue to observe, and maybe even if we can, try to engage some of these kind of public and audience on how do we actually define like civic program, like you're saying, like what is civic program and what is civic program now in 2021 for Hong Kong right now. And I think that's where I think we will take further our development and of kind of as you know, our scheme has so many different kind of iterations of kind of what public space is, but then for us is then how do we kind of hone in on that, and so relating to Katie's comment, you know, how do we hone in on those on kind of grounding that in stakeholders, audience, who is using these public spaces, how do we actually design civic spaces for these audiences?
Yeah, and for me, I think the whole process has revealed to me a kind of idea about etiquette of the designer that is operating at Site 3. Meaning, I think towards the south side, there are a lot of forces coming from the GPO, coming from the clock tower, coming from City Hall, that almost require the designer to concede a little bit, to be more polite, to be more respectful, to respond to the extension of the public spaces that these three important structures can offer, and that the quality of the landmark spaces that these important historical relics, well, not necessarily relic, but these civic functions could support and could thrive in this area to draw people towards the north. So in conceding there, we think that it can probably be compensated by, let's say, for the lack of a better word, a more aggressive manner of planning towards the north. Meaning, if you imagine, this point didn't really come across in my presentation, but the pedestrianization of that street coming from the north of IFC and across to the east side of Site 3. If all those spaces are, informed by the program adjacent to it from day one, so that we are actively thinking about how Site 3 would expand towards the east and the north, I think Site 3 should not limit its influence entirely within the site boundary. It should be informing the circulation coming from the piers. It should be utilizing the GPO to draw people from the larger central. It should be informing the connection to the government headquarters. And that actually would guarantee the success and, like you said, the sustainability of Site 3 in relation to the other open spaces in the vicinity. So there's always a kind of push and pull and a kind of symbiosis with the commerce that is yet to happen within the site. And yeah, I think these all actually will relate to a kind of etiquette or a kind of understanding of how respectful we are to the context in operating at Site 3.
Shall I come in now? So I think yeah, Katie, in response to your question, specifically how we move forward to the end of April, as it were, I think it is very much a situation where Cecilia's comments are very much part of that process, because I think as our team, as we are three separate teams and we're presenting, or we're looking at separate elements, we're going to take the connectivity side of things and start maybe looking at it far more in an urban planning rather than an architectural direction, and then try and layer in the economic, social, civic, experiential, even symbolic elements of what we're looking at and Hong Kong itself, and also trying to bring in this sense of place and sense of belonging, so that we try and hang some reasonable flesh on the bones of our connectivity matrix, as it were. But that flesh is, I don't think we should be looking, our team should not be looking at that as an architectural solution, but more as a planning solution, which would be dealing more with programs and how these programs interconnect and what the connectivity in terms, not just physical connectivity, but again, those elements, the less tangible elements might be, and investigate those further. At the same time as honing the matrix that we're working on to become more practical and more, how to put it, realistic in the sort of socio-economic situation that we're in. That we're in, being in the middle of Central, which is very much a high vibrancy and high rent location. So that I think is how we will move forward, is to bring on different layers, show the connectivity between those layers, not just the physical layers, and hopefully crystallize our ideas a little bit more so that it's more easily legible by the general public and not just us professionals.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think it is. I very much agree on what you have said. It's our interest is not only to argue that the conservation, keeping the GPO is more, it's a better solution. We're not only arguing that, but we are also trying to propose possible planning or architectural solution to around the idea of keeping the GPO. And from my side, I think it's pretty important to keep a certain level of realness. What I mean is that the project should not detach itself from the reality of the socio-economical situation, and without looking at the factors that governs the development of land and buildings in Hong Kong by so much. I think our our studio really want to do is to propose is to look at the architectural potential, the possibility of keeping the GPO while really still take care of all the reality, taking care of the socio-economical factors that governs it, the development of the project, and I think by looking into that, we might be able to have a better ground to argue for the conservation of the GPO.
That's a really interesting point, Charles, and it kind of is a segue to one audience questions, which is, how do you invite the underserved or minorities to engage in the design process? They tend to shy away, and designers seem to design what's best on their behalf. So do any of the three teams have, or Cecilia, have some insights? Katie as well, do you have any insights on how do we invite the underserved or minorities to engage in this process? And feel free to
just add to, we'll come back to this question, so I just want to add to Charles first and then link to this. About thinking about the architectural potentials, I guess the questions to ask is the other way around, is to how do you link these kind of potentials with the other potentials? And that comes back to this idea of how the forms relating to all these sort of complex and contradictory processes. Sometimes I'd like to maybe think about the counter argument, like the GPO itself. One interesting thing about it is that I believe the panel here are all for the GPO kind of affirming the value of the buildings. But we also know that I think some members in the public may contest that idea. They think that the building is not so beautiful or not to their taste. I have colleagues that even ask, why are you joining this panel? Because the building should be demolished. So then if you use that as a frame to rethink the reasons for preserving it, you would move away only from the architecture, right? So the questions becomes, what kind of values can you create? And what sort of values has already inscribed? How do you link these different sets of values together and create new relationships? So what does that mean? How do you make this space useful for particular types of people or more groups of people? And it also has a kind of symbolic values to me. One of these things that I thought would be useful to think about also is about, again, as Charles talked about the histories of that building. To me, it reminds me of the commitment of the government in the mid-20th century, the commitment to public goods. That's the kind of relationships and values that marked that time in the early 20th century, not early, the mid to late 20th century, when we have a very different relationships with these sort of public goods, public services, the commitment, the investment on public services. So in what way can we preserve this building and preserve those relationship values? Does it have to be a commercial building? Does it have to be, what if it's a public buildings in combination with some other things, then can create new relationships? So as I pointed out earlier, that how do we expand our imagination to incorporate these kind of different meanings that is suitable for the 21st century that we aspire to? And so I think that also relates to link to this question about inclusiveness. Probably that idea of inclusiveness wasn't so much present 20, 30 years ago, but things have moved on and we have new uses of the spaces by the different stakeholders. And that's something I believe that the workshop that ULI did before had invoked quite a lot of those questions of the different types of users and different days and how do we incorporate and think about them together. So yeah.
Great.
Can I add to this response? Now, I have talked about various public buildings in my sharing. The Central Market, the PMQ, West Wing. Prior to the government's decision to conserve these buildings, there were always people who raised this challenge about how undeserving, how not unappealing these buildings are, and that they are not really worthy of conservation. There has always been this kind of challenge before. And after the public discussion, the debate, and the eventual agreement by the government and other stakeholders that these buildings are worth conserving, and the whole conservation process being completed. Most of the time, and my conservation observations is that people think they are worth conserving in the end. Now, people really like the PMQ, at least they really appreciate that these set of buildings have been conserved and they are now in more public use, community use. And we now see the Central Market being conserved. And it really looks nice. And we are anticipating, a really interesting building and the programs that are coming up. We see the West Wing being conserved, and people really appreciate that, oh, at last, we don't have to see another new commercial high-rise, but another historic building being conserved. At the end of the day, people really appreciate its conservation. So I have a very strong feeling that our GPO, if the government and the developer really decides to conserve it, they will find it worthy of conservation. And people, if they can think of a program or a new uses for this building, it should really spark imagination, spark, become an inspiration for our city to move on. So I would encourage our 3 teams to continue their journey to figure out more ideas, and to continue to share with the public on different platforms, so that this could really be a conversation with the community, the commercial parties, or our developers, and the government as well. I would very much appreciate that there would be a continuous conversation also with our groups, our newcomers that would be joining this conversation, the people, the teams that would be joining this discussion after today. Thank you.
Can I just add something in there, please? Because I just noticed that that question has been put into the answered column rather than the open column, which I don't think it really has been answered. The one regarding how do you invite undeserved minority to engage in the design process? I can understand that question, and going back 2 years or a year and a half, we would normally have charrettes, we'd sit around a table, we'd invite interested parties in to express their ideas, express their thoughts. And it used to be much more of a collaborative basis. We're still trying to learn how to deal with this remote communication system, especially when we're looking at crossing from professions to try and engage the public, as it were. I'm reading into that it may be the general public rather than the professional public that the question has been raised about. And that maybe there seems to be a very prescriptive submission requirements for the competition, as it were, and quite an onerous submission requirement for an individual, say, to make some kind of contribution. Is there some kind of 2-level contributory mechanism by which, yes, we can have groups and teams submitting fully produced ideas, but also maybe like a Dropbox type situation where more of the general public, the interested public, can actually drop in thoughts and ideas that can be in themselves presented at the public forum.
Yeah, great suggestion. I think that would be finding ways of just making it easier for anyone from the public to, as you said, put something in a Dropbox and get it into the conversation. So thank you for sharing that. Any last thoughts from any of the teams or the other panelists? I think we're reaching toward the end of our time here.
Yeah, I think I want to add another point to that comment as well. I think the issue of inclusiveness and how do we actually invite kind of different communities. I mean, in some of the projects we've done, we actually took it to the street and we would bring these questions out to the street literally. And I think, not sure between now and, we hope we would have an opportunity to do that. And if, Ricky, Adrian, Charles, if you guys are interested, like we would be more than happy to kind of join forces of like how we might be able to do that. But I think it's actually quite easy if we are, if we are willing to sort of put our efforts out there and kind of show some of our progress and even just very informal conversations. And I think we're happy to kind of find a way to do that. So I think it's just a matter of will. And I think the Dropbox idea is really, really good as well. Like how do we create another channel, maybe even, online as well, if there's a way to do that for the public.
Great, thanks so much, Eric. All right then, it seems like we're kind of reaching the end of our time, and yep. Sorry.
I think Yeah, I think it's a great idea. We all long for personal interaction, I think. So if you really, the three teams can really take their proposals and ideas to the street and interact with people, collect some feedbacks, that would be most welcome. I think that's great. That's great. And of course, Dropbox is also a great idea. So I am hoping to see it's a kind of, a dialogue between us, ULI, and the teams together with the public, and to really to get as much as response and ideas as possible to bring us to to the end of the process. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. That was a lot of really fabulous insights from all of these folks who are thinking about and working on these issues. I guess just a very last quick reminder then is kind of if you go to newcentral.org, there's some information about submitting your ideas. We will probably, if you keep your eyes out in this space here, we'll find ways that make it even easier for anyone from the public to engage in this process. Just a quick reminder about the timeline again. Now that the Spark Salon has gone forward, you have several weeks to kind of come up with additional ideas and bring them in. We'll have discussions about the different types of ideas that come through the door. And then of course, a public celebration of all of the ideas and kind of making those public and part of this process of thinking about Site 3. So thanks so much. Gonna turn it over to Tiffany.
Thanks, Kevin. And thank you everyone for participating tonight, to our esteemed panelists, and definitely to our three design firms that have been so intrepid and brave to lead with their ideas. It's truly inspirational. When I first envisioned this event, I was really hoping it could be a true salon versus a virtual one where we might be able to continue the conversation over some drinks. But I look forward to that opportunity sometime in the future. Again, thank you tonight. We really encourage not just the folks that joined us tonight on the call to submit, but tell your friends, tell everyone about this. It really is about a ground up sort of movement to get this conversation going, to bring it to that big audience, because the future of our city depends on that. So thank you again. Thank you on behalf of ULI. Yeah, we look forward to seeing all these great ideas. Good night.
Thanks, Tiffany.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
You.
Thanks, everyone.